So today we're going to be making Kraut-chi, which I'll talk a little bit more about what that is and where that name comes from. But I wanted to say a little bit about myself and about this workshop. So for some of you, this might be your first time coming to a Building Community Ferment workshop. Others may have been to a couple before. I've been working with the Yolo County Public Library Davis branch, specifically with Joan Tuss there at the library, to co-organize this series called Building Community Ferment since May of 2018. So it's been ongoing for a while now. And the idea behind it was to use fermenting vegetables and making different fermented foods as an opportunity to do something collaborative with your neighbors, and something that's fun and something that's experimental, and it's free and everyone is welcome to participate in it. Of course, we all had to move online, and so I'm glad that the workshop's been able to continue in some capacity, but I'm really looking forward to the day when we can all be together in person, making these things together and having it be much more of an interactive workshop. So I appreciate those of you who've been able to show up in the online platform. I know that's it's a struggle for many of us. But yeah, so keep your eyes out for information from the Yolo Public Library about future events. We have a couple planned for 2021 that are going to be on different topics. So we switch the topic every time. It's always a fermented food, but it depends on the season, or just if I haven't talked about that topic in a while. Some of the things we've addressed in the past have been sourdough. So everybody's been crazy about sourdough bread since the quarantine started. So I will lead a workshop on starting your own sourdough starter and how to use that and other things if you don't really want to make bread. I'll also have a workshop on making sauerkrauts of different flavors, and one on brining whole vegetables, as well as a workshop on making kombucha, which is a fermented tea that you might have seen in the grocery store, and other fermented sodas. So that's all to come. Keep an eye out for that one. But like I said, today we're going to be making Kraut-chi. So it's kind of a funny name. It is a name that I get from one of my favorite teachers of fermentation. His name is Sander Katz, and he has two books, which I can show you. It's actually more than two books now, but he has a book called Wild Fermentation, which is his first book, and it's some lovely short stories and recipes about fermentation of different vegetables and beans and proteins, and making kombucha and other kinds of drinks. And then later on, he wrote a nice big encyclopedia style book called The Art of Fermentation, that's just full of recipes from all over the world of different kinds of approaches to fermented foods and maybe what those mean to the different communities that make them. And so there's recipes, there's stories, there's explanation, there's pictures. So this is a really fun book, but Sander Katz is one of my favorite teachers of all things fermented. And so the reason that I'm teaching a class on Kraut-chi is because that's a word that he developed. There's a lot of fermented foods, I'll just say at the top, are so important to cultures all over the world. They're some of the most cherished foods in cultures all over the world. They're some of the most celebrated and some of the oldest foods that people have to share with, across generations. And certainly that is the case for kimchi, which is maybe something that you've heard of before, which is a fermented cabbage, a spicy fermented cabbage made in Korea. And there's so much that can be said about kimchi and the history of it and the way different families have their own unique recipes, and especially women have carried down particular practices around kimchi, and it's incredibly important part of the cultural heritage of many Koreans. So I wouldn't know how to start making a kimchi. I hadn't, and no one has shown me how to make that. I don't have that as a part of my own cultural heritage. So that's why, I don't say we're going to make kimchi, because I think there's a whole history and tradition and contemporary, spin on it that I just don't have access to. So that's why I like the idea of a Kraut-chi. So you take the kraut from, a sauerkraut, which also has a lot of heritage around it, a lot of German cultures or German society makes a sauerkraut. But the combo of a Kraut-chi is a kind of playful way of taking the basics of a sauerkraut, which really is just shredded cabbage and salt, and bringing in some of the flavorings that are central to kimchi. So that would be like garlic and ginger and chilies. And in particular, I'm going to talk about a fermented chili paste that isn't necessarily used in kimchi. It's more of like a condiment, you know, that you would use as you eat. But I find that it works well as a flavoring for a Kraut-chi, and that's called gochujang. And there is, you can find these in the supermarket. It's a fermented red pepper chili paste with some other, you know, important ingredients in it. It's not gluten-free, so I'll just say that. It has wheat flour in it. But it will help to give this Kraut-chi spicy flavor profile that is going to be unique to this particular dish. Overall, what I'm going to be doing, I will go in a step-by-step direction with this workshop in the hopes that you will be able to follow it when you get your own kit. So I'll just say right now, and I'll remind you at the end, please put your email address in the chat, and then that way I can get in touch with you after this workshop, and I will, you know, hand deliver you a kit that will have everything you need to make your own Kraut-chi. And so I'll just kind of say a little bit about what that kit will be. It'll, you know, come in a little brown paper bag with the Building Community Ferment logo on it. And I'll include a glass jar for you, as well as all of the materials that I'm using today will also be included in the kit. So please put your email address in there, and I'll make sure that you get a free kit. And I have the UC Davis Global Affairs program to thank for that. They gave me a small grant that I can use for materials. So exciting. So let's get started with our Kraut-chi. Oh, I wanted to show you a picture. That's why I brought this up. The other thing that your kit will include is a recipe. So it may not be exactly what I'm doing today, but I did make a copy of a recipe from Sandra Katz's book for Kraut-chi. So you'll have a copy of this and you can reference it if you need some help along the way. This is one of Sandra Katz's newest book called Fermentation as Metaphor, and it has some really beautiful pictures. So I just wanted to share this. This is an electron microscope photograph of a radish kraut. And so you can see the little microorganisms there that are colored orange. They don't look like that through the microscope. They're colored after the fact. But that's just, you know, a real close look at what kinds of microorganisms we're gonna cultivate on this Kraut-chi today. You might have different levels of experience with fermentation, you know, and I think part of the reason why I wanted to design this workshop is that it's meant to be a really low barrier to entry. So I'm going to assume you don't know anything about it, and the point is we're going to explore it together and have fun and learn and make some mistakes and learn from them as we go along. It's a very forgiving medium, working with fermented vegetables. There's not a lot you can do to mess it up, so we try to keep it really simple. And it's simple because it means that more people can participate in the process. So just say at the top that the kind of fermentation that we're doing is also called lactofermentation because it's using a particular microorganism, lactobacillus, that comes to dominate the fermented food that we make. So you might be familiar with pickles, maybe in the grocery store, pickled cucumbers that use vinegar to get that really yummy, amazing, sour, tangy taste that we like in our pickles. So lots of people do use vinegar and salt and spices together to pickle different things. But what we're doing here is we're only going to use salt. We're using salt, and we're going to cultivate all of the microorganisms that are already on our vegetables that we're using. And we're going to create an environment that is too salty for some microbes to live in, but just the right amount for others. And those are the ones that we want to feel happy so that they can start, you know, digesting our kraut and giving us these really yummy, funky flavors that we can attribute to lacto-fermented vegetables. This process doesn't require a refrigerator. It doesn't require any special equipment, which is why it's so fun and accessible, I think, to use this kind of fermentation process as we go forward. All right, so let's get started. The first couple, I'm going to go through the ingredients first, and then I'll go through the process, and then I will demo it for you. And then there'll be time at the end for any questions and answers that come up as you go along. And certainly as I'm doing something, if you have a question about it, go ahead and put it in the chat, and I'll be sure to check it every once in a while just to make sure that I'm getting your questions answered. The first major ingredient I'm going to use is a cabbage. So I like to use Napa cabbage for this recipe. It has these beautiful curly leaves and this nice center stalk that is really crunchy. And I really like the texture of Napa cabbage. It's really tasty for this recipe. But you could also use just a regular, or I mean a green cabbage. It's not like it's regular. You could use a green cabbage if that's what you have on hand. It's not has to only be the Napa cabbage, but I do like the way it tastes and the texture that I get from using a Napa cabbage on this recipe. So I'm going to put that aside and show you my other ingredients before I get started. The next thing that is really crucial to making a Kraut-chi, I think, is a radish. So the primary ingredients that we're working with here, the primary vegetables, are cabbage and radish. One of my favorite radishes for this is the daikon radish, which is a beautiful white, crispy, I mean, it's just like awesome texture. And it's not overly spicy the way maybe some other radishes that you've eaten are. So it has a kind of a mild flavor, but is really yummy and still tastes like a radish for sure. Another one that I happen to have on hand, because I get some fun produce from the UC Davis Student Farm, is it's a beautiful, oh, what was it called? Is it a rainbow radish? No, I can't think of the name. But I'll show you why it has this, oh, watermelon radish. That's why. That's why it's a watermelon radish. So these are beautiful radishes that have this like gorgeous pink star looking inside. And these also have a mild flavor. They're not very strong or spicy, but maybe I'll put some of my watermelon radish in there as well. Another ingredient that's totally optional, but I just happen to have a lot of them around because, again, the Student Farms CSA is awesome, but I get a lot of things that I don't really know what to do with. And I'll just, an aside, that's also kind of why I love fermenting vegetables, is if you get something and you're like, what do I do with this? Ferment it, see what happens, give it a try. And it's a nice way to experiment eating different kinds of vegetables that you aren't really sure what to do with. So, for example, I have these beautiful turnips. They're called Tokyo turnips is the particular kind of turnip that they are. And they're a little bit sweet. And I know some folks love to like roast turnips and eat them. That's not my favorite way to eat them. So I find that I like it better when I put them in a kraut or a Kraut-chi. So we've got the turnips, the radishes, the cabbage, and then the thing that's going to bring the like wonderful flavors forward are all of the, I guess, spices and additional flavorings that we're going to add to it. So we're definitely going to put some garlic in there. So I have some garlic cloves that we will add to this mix. I have some fresh ginger that I will peel and add to the mix. Ginger is a really wonderful vegetable to use when you're fermenting because it is so covered in microorganisms, the root, so it stays underground and it gets covered with these wonderful soil microorganisms that really make your ferments kind of come to life. So the other big ingredient here is a chili. So we're bringing in some kind of a spice to this tasty ferment we're making. So I could use dried chilies or raw, whole, spicy chilies, but I actually like to use 2 flavorings instead. It's easier and I don't get spicy stuff all over my fingers and then accidentally touch my eyes and, it turns into a whole mess. So the first thing here is a chili garlic sauce from Hoi Fong Foods, which also makes sriracha sauce, kind of a popular spicy sauce. But they have this product that is just chilies and garlic that I love to put on so many different things. Then I'm going to go ahead and use that Korean red pepper fermented paste, gochujang, in the ferment itself. And so I might just use like a tablespoon of this. You can also buy this in the grocery store and it has very different flavors. Some are more sweet, some are more spicy. This version is extra spicy. So we'll try that one. And lastly, the most important ingredient when you're doing a lacto ferment is salt. So I like to use this Redmond's real salt, which is a sea salt. You can use any salt you have, except I found that iodized salt doesn't work super well with fermented foods. Something about the process can kind of gets in the way of the microbial activity. So I would say any kind of sea salt is usually great for a fermented project. Cool, so that's all our ingredients. So now let's go ahead and get started. There's 2 ways that you can go about it. There's probably more ways, but I'll tell you 2 ways. Getting your vegetables ready. You can chop them, so you can use a knife and you can cut them into a shape or size or thickness that you like, which will help impact the overall texture of your ferment. And the other thing you can do is use a grater, so a cheese grater or a box grater. And you can use this to just shred everything so that it's all the same consistency. It's totally up to you. It's chopper's choice. So I say you can use a knife and cut things into a size you want, or you can use a grater. Sometimes I like to use the grater just because it goes faster. And so if I want the project to get going, I will just grate everything. But sometimes that can make things a little, everything becomes a little too fine. And I like to have some textural element to it. So what I'm going to do today, and what I might recommend for you when you get the opportunity to make it, is I like to chop the cabbage with a knife and then shred the radishes. And I think that combo makes a really nice final product in my mind, but you should definitely experiment with how you like. So I'm going to work on the cabbage first. That means I'm going to take off some of the outer leaves that maybe look a little gnarly or a little browned, depending on what state your cabbage is in. And these will come in useful later on, so don't just throw them away. If they have visible mold on them, you can go ahead and toss them. But if they just look a little ragged, I would say just put them to the side for now, because we'll use them at the end of our process. So I'm going to cut the core off, which is the end of the cabbage, because I don't really want to use that. And I'm going to kind of stack the leaves up so that I'm cutting them in an even way. And with a Napa cabbage, the base of the leaf, if you haven't worked with them before, is a lot thicker because it has this like stem running through it. So I want to just make sure that the bases are all lined up so that I can chop them evenly, and I don't end up with like these giant stem pieces, And by the time I'm getting to the top here, it's pretty much all leaf. So I'm just kind of going to fold it over so it's not so gigantic. And I will finish cutting this. I'm going to invite my helper up right now so that he can help me prep some more of this material. I'm very fortunate, and if you've been to the workshop before, you know that my kids are awesome helpers, and Ozzy and Elliot have led many workshops with me. So this is Ozzy. Hello. He's gonna help me by helping to start with the flavorings that we're adding. So I put a piece of ginger over here for him, and he's gonna use a back of the spoon to peel a ginger. So sometimes it's really hard to peel them, and if you use a peeler, you take so much of it off. So I've actually found that just scraping a spoon removes the outer skin, but doesn't take away all the vegetable. So a little ginger hack for you. Now I'm gonna finish chopping up the cabbage. This is like kind of the core part that just stayed together. So I'll just keep chopping it. Chopping it not super fine, maybe like 1/4 of an inch slices. That's about the texture that I want to have. Because as it ferments, it will break down. The cabbage will become much softer, and I don't want it to be super, super thin because I might lose any crunch. But if it's too thick, then it'll take forever for it to get fermented, all the way through. So you kind of want that middle space where it's thick enough that you're going to have some texture in the final product, but it's thin enough that it actually ferments all the way through. Okay, almost done with this cabbage. That'll do. So you can see we have pretty much a big bowl here of cabbage, and it's going to shrink down as we keep working with it. But for now, I'm going to move into my next ingredient, which is the daikon radish. So maybe I'll use a little bit of a bigger one. In terms of amounts, you know, I usually just work with what I have. I like to keep about, if I'm working with a cabbage kraut, like Kraut-chi or a sauerkraut, I want the majority of the vegetable matter to be cabbage. And so I try to think about maybe half as much as all the other stuff. So for example, I have a kraut I really love to make that's purple cabbage, carrot, and ginger. And so I use, you know, a lot of purple cabbage, and then I use maybe half as much carrot. So that the primary flavor you're getting is that cabbage. So I'm gonna do the same thing here where I've got quite a lot of cabbage from the Napa cabbage. So I'm gonna use about half as much, maybe less than that, of the radish, depending on what you have on hand. Questions? Oh, great, yeah. So please add your emails into the chat so that I can make sure to get you a kit. This shreds really nicely. I always have to give a warning with box graters because you can very easily just like shave your knuckles off. So make sure you're paying attention if you're using a box grater and using something that grates so easily. Gotta kind of pay attention. Ginger? Yeah, that's great. Okay. So that one looks pretty good. I might go all the way to the nub, but in interest of time, I'm going to move forward a little bit. So I'm going to put that turnip, nope, not turnip, radish in there. I might actually use a little bit more. I'm going to move ahead just so that you can see the progress of the final product. But I would probably put another one of those radishes in there just so that it could have a nice ratio. Just so you can also see, I'm gonna cut some like really thin slices of this watermelon radish. And maybe I'll leave them nice and big like this. And that will, as long as they're thin, you know, it's okay that they're kind of big. You know, and maybe we'll put these in there too, and it'll look really pretty as it gets going. Chop them in half. And so on. I could add the turnips as well. I think I might also shred the turnips because they have a similar texture as the radish. So that would be a great addition. Next, I'm gonna grab this big chunk of ginger. So the ginger, if you're someone who doesn't particularly love ginger, one thing you could do is, you know, cut a chunk of it because the flavor is wonderful. And so maybe if, you know, you are okay with it, but you don't want to eat a big chunk of it, you can actually throw this whole knob of ginger in there. And then when you're ready to eat it, you can just take that knob out. So the flavor of the ginger will come through, but you won't end up eating a big old chunk of it. I personally really like the flavor of ginger. I like the taste of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it very finely into little tiny pieces that are small enough that I wouldn't mind biting and being like, oh, that's ginger, you know? So you want it to be small enough that it just, you don't just get a big old chunk of ginger. So that's about as good as I like it. It doesn't need to be super fine. So we got the ginger, and I would say for a head of cabbage that was that big, personally, I like about a tablespoon of ginger. And I would do the same thing with garlic. I love garlic, so I would use about 4 or 5 cloves of garlic in this much. But that's going to be up to you. You know, that's the generous, awesome thing about working with fermented vegetables is you get to decide what goes into it. You get to decide how much goes into it. The flavors will all intensify through the fermentation process. So that means that if you're someone who thinks ginger is okay, you might not want to do a whole tablespoon. You know, you might just do a 1/4 tablespoon to start, because the flavor will meld and actually intensify as the fermentation process happens. Same thing for garlic. I don't understand these people, but I know there are people that aren't crazy about garlic. So same thing. You may just put a whole clove in there and then take it out when you're ready to eat it, or you would skip it, you know, entirely. But just think about how much you're gonna wanna eat, how strong you want that flavor to be, and only add as much as you like. You can also experiment. You know, you could cut this batch into 2 batches, and you could see, okay, if I put a lot more garlic in this one and a little less in this one, and then you can actually see what it's like as it progresses. So I really encourage you to just experiment, have fun, try different combinations, and come up with something that you really like for yourself. All right, so I'm gonna move ahead. I've got all of my baseline, vegetables in here. Now I'm gonna add some of these seasonings that I like to work with. So again, you could just add raw chili to this if that's something you have on hand. You don't need to use any of these prepared materials. I just like to use them because it's just easy and it's kind of an instant flavoring to what I'm making. So I'm gonna go ahead and put in a tablespoon of this chili garlic sauce, which is pretty spicy. So I don't want to do too much. I've definitely done too much on this recipe before. And yeah, it's been hard to eat. So I'm going to do the same thing with the gochujang. Do about a tablespoon. This is way sticky. I don't know if you just saw the chili garlic paste comes out. It's quite liquidy. But this is really sticky, like a mix between honey and barbecue sauce. So I'm going to go ahead and do a chunk of that in there. Then, most importantly, we got to add the salt, because the salt is what's going to make the right condition for the microorganisms to do their work in this fermentation. For about this much, if you want to get very scientific, you want to use 2% salt. So you take the volume, the weight, I guess, of all of the vegetable matter that you're working with, and you want to do a 2% salt addition. I tend to eyeball it a little bit more, and I usually work with the same amount of materials, so it's usually like a head of cabbage and some extra materials. And I find that about a tablespoon of salt does it for me. But again, here's the best part about this process is you want to kind of taste as you go. And that way you can control the flavor and you can control how much of the salty flavor is coming through. Just saw some things pop up. All right, oh good, got another email. Yay, please add your emails in there. So I'm actually gonna start with half of this salt because I'm worried that it might be too much, might be too salty, because the prepared ingredients I use also have salt in them. So altogether, it might be too much. So I'm actually gonna cover this up and I'm gonna hand it over to my helper to start the mixing. So what Ozzy's gonna do is he's going to use his hands and he's just gonna start to mix everything together. It takes pressure because what we're doing is using that salt to break down the cell walls of the vegetables, right? Of the cabbage, of the radish, and the salt breaks that cell wall and it releases the water that's within it. So eventually what we're going for here is all of the vegetable matter becomes softer and the salt allows it to release water. So we end up with this nice juice at the bottom of the ferment. And that is the key to the next step, which I'll talk about as Ozzy finishes up. Because you're like, okay, how do we go from this, which is actually pretty tasty. I don't mind eating like some chopped up cabbage and some radish with some flavoring on it. That sounds yummy. But we want it to become fermented and to have this like really lovely, funky smell to it and taste and flavor that is unique in the world. The fermented flavors are quite unique. So the key to that is we're going to put it, the mixture when Ozzy's done, we're gonna move it into a glass, plastic, or ceramic vessel. I would just advise against using metal because the acidity of the ferment can react with the metal and you might get an off flavor. But you could use, you can use like a fancy glass jar like this, or you can use like a plastic tub, or if you have like a ceramic crock, sometimes they make beautiful vessels for fermentation. But in my life, I find that these ball jars, they just work the best. I mean, they're for canning, but we're not going to be canning. But I find that this one works well. So yeah, this is a glass jar. It's let's see, 7, 8 cups. So it's one of the bigger sizes. And I use the bigger size just so that it has enough room in it. But I've definitely used the smaller ones if that's all I have on hand. You just split it up into 2 different jars. So the process from here on out, that's what I was getting at, is we're going to move everything into the jar, and then we're gonna leave this jar in a room temperature place. Go ahead and mix that just a little bit more so we can get some liquid at the bottom. Doing awesome. Yeah, I mean, this is actually pretty quick. I would say it usually takes about 10 minutes for me to get the cabbage to the level where it looks like it's really mixed through and there's liquid, but Ozzy's like strong, so it's it's coming along a lot faster than if I do it. Okay, that looks great, actually. Go ahead. You can wash your hands off if you want. I'm going to show everybody this because he did a great job. So you can see that everything is all mixed together now, so there's no more pockets of radish, pockets of kraut. The seasoning is all mixed in there together. The salt is mixed in. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to taste. Tastes pretty good. A little spicy. But what I'm really tasting for right now is I'm tasting for salt. Because if I eat it and I was like, ooh, I taste salt, that's too much salt. So it's too salty if you get to that point. So that's why we add just half of it, mix it up, and I actually don't really taste any saltiness. I just taste the spices. So I might just add a little tiny bit more, which actually takes me right to the tablespoon that I had initially set out in the first place. So then I would, reincorporate this and taste it again and make sure that it's at the right level. And I'm cheating a little bit because I know this is the right amount because I've done this before. But for you, if it's your first time doing it, taste again. Excellent. It's just the right amount. It's like that on the back of my tongue, I taste a little bit of saltiness, but it's not the first thing I taste. So it's like perfect for me. Cool. Thank you. Mm-hmm. You are relieved of your duties. All right. So the next step, like I'm saying, is we want to move it from our mixing bowl to the fermentation vessel itself. And you can just use your hand to do that. They probably have a special tool. If you're someone who really gets into this world, feel free to check out all of the special gear and equipment you can buy. The home fermenting has really gotten very popular, I would say, in the last year or so. So if this is something that you're like, yes, this world speaks to me, there's so many opportunities for you to get involved, and there's fermentation clubs and fermentation festivals, and it can be a really fun world if that's something you want to get in. Super important here, you can see all the liquid in there that we produce just from squeezing the cabbage. So this is a great amount. I'm just going to pour it in over the top. If you, for whatever reason in your ferment, find that there wasn't enough liquid or it didn't produce any, which sometimes happens if I'm using like an older cabbage that's been in the fridge for a while, it gets kind of dried out. But it's totally good to use for fermentation. You kind of have two options if you have a really dry cabbage. The first is that you can add some filtered water. So you maybe just start with 2 tablespoons or like a 1/4 cup of filtered water. And that should be enough to kind of make it nice and moist and wet. The other thing you can do is if you already, have a batch going of Kraut-chi that tastes yummy, like I do here, that's about as much as I can save in this house. I'll tell you how to use it up after I finish this, but it goes pretty fast around here. Another thing you can do is it's called back slopping. Really gross term. I don't know why we call it that. But what you can use is the juice from a previous ferment. You can use it to kind of kickstart a new one. So that both provides some liquid to it, but it also provides all of the microorganisms that are in this ferment and have made it so tasty and wonderful. It like introduces those into this new environment where they can start to get to work. So what I've done here with my hand is I've just kind of pushed down, there we go, I'll do that way. I'm pushing down this shredded material with like the back of my fingers, just so that it's nice and level. I'm not using a ton of force, but I'm also making sure that everything is underneath the liquid, or it's like wet, right? What you don't want is for stuff to be exposed to the air, because air and fermented foods equals mold. So if air is involved, you're going to end up with mold on it. But if you keep everything underneath the water or in a wet environment like this, you're probably going to keep most of the mold away. So it's all packed in there. It's salted, it's spiced, it's all ready to go. I'm going to go back to these leaves that I pulled aside in the first place. And I'm going to kind of rip it off until it's about the size of the diameter of this jar. because I'm going to use this as like a lid, right? So now this leaf becomes the barrier between the air that's in the jar and the ferment that I want to keep. So if it does form some mold, or if it starts to get kind of gross on the top because it's oxidization, it's exposed to the air, I can just throw that leaf away, and all the kraut underneath it is nice and tasty, and it hasn't been, ruined. So that's kind of the process for getting it going, right? I've prepped all the materials, I shredded them, I added my spices. Ozzy, mixed really well with his hands so that it got broken down and lots of liquid was released. And I end up with a jar that has some wet looking material that is covered, it's all underneath the liquid, and I'm using that leaf as kind of like a lid for the inside of the material. So that's it in terms of the preparation. Now, the last part, and the kind of most important part of this process, is we have to wait. We need to wait, and we need to set the conditions so that the microorganisms that are all over this cabbage and all over the radishes that we use, we want those microbes to do their thing, which is like eat. We want them to eat things. We want them to transform this cabbage into something that is tasty and tangy and gives us these really wonderful, unique flavors of fermentation. And we do that by leaving this jar in a room temperature environment. You want to kind of leave it out of direct sunlight because that might get too hot, but certainly just, like you could put it on top of the fridge. That's a good spot for it. You could just leave it out on your kitchen counter, wherever it won't annoy family members or roommates, because it does get a little stinky as it starts to ferment. Also, heads up on that one. You can put a lid on it, but don't tighten the lid. So, I put it on and I just turn it so that it doesn't pop off, but I'm not going to tighten it really, really hard, because part of what happens as the microbes do their thing in there is that they release CO2. And so if you had the lid on there really tightly, you would end up building a lot of pressure in here, right, as the CO2 builds. And, I've heard of glass jars exploding, especially if you aren't using things that are meant for, canning or high temperature, they can explode. I've never had that happen, but it definitely does happen. So I should tell you about that before. Another way that you can avoid any potential bomb making activities is to make sure that you're checking it frequently, which is, I think, a part of the process. So I was going to leave this, out on my kitchen counter. And I think at about day 2, I would take off the lid, I would give it a smell, and you'll be like, wow, that smells different. And smell as you go. Like, just smelling it right now is like, oh, I really smell that chili. I really smell the radish. But by day 2, it's going to smell completely different. It's going to have such a different sensory experience. So again, day 2, give it a smell. Still smells good? Great. You may check this leaf at day 2 and be like, okay, do you still look okay? Are you getting a little grayish, And if it looks kind of gross, or if there's a slime or anything, a film forming on it, just toss it, and you can use another one to keep the rest of your cabbage down on top, right? Okay, so that's day 2. Then I'm going to put the lid back on, again, loosely, so that you can have a place for that CO2 to release. So now day 4, another 2 days in, same thing. Smell it, check it visually. Now I might want to taste it after about 4 days, because at that point, it's going to start to develop those flavors that are very different from just the original ingredients we put in. So day 4, give it a taste. I find that temperature makes such a huge difference. If it's in the summertime, usually within 3 days, I've got something that is really tangy and yummy. Wintertime, it's going to go slower because it's just not as warm. Even in your house, it's not 80, 90 degrees. So for this one, let's see. I made this on 11/14, and I think I packaged it. I put the lid on and put it in the fridge after about a week. So this one I made in the middle of November, and it took me about a week for it to get to a flavor that I really enjoyed. So as soon as that happens for you, when your ferment gets to a flavor that you're like, oh, that tastes really nice, I like that, You can then you can tighten the lid and you put it into your refrigerator and it'll last for months. It'll last for as long as it continues to look and smell tasty to you. If you start to ever see brightly colored molds, that would be a red flag. That rarely happens. And honestly, this stuff goes pretty quick in my house. But I have some ferments that have been in their cabbage ferments for like 2 years, and I still eat off of them. You know, they tend to like taste a little bit more alcoholic and like vinegary. So I don't use them in everything, but they're certainly not harmful. They're safe to eat. And so that's kind of it. You get it to a point where you like where it tastes, and then you put it in your fridge. I did miss an important step. I left the marker out to remind me. On the day that you put it, or the day that you make it, you want to give it a name, right? So we'll just call this we'll call this spicy pants. Or you can add the ingredients. That's also a nice thing. So you remember, okay, what did I put in this one? Okay, it's cabbage, it's turnip, it's whatever, right? But I like to give it a nice anthropomorphic name. And then you write the date on there. Any help with the date, Ozzy? 16. There we go. I got it. So 12, 16, 20. And that way I know when it started to ferment, because then you'll know if it's been a week, you know, or if it's been 2 weeks and you really are like, okay, I should get that in the fridge. So that's important. Date it, name it, so that you know what you're working with.